Hi everyone, Team 3401 here, and we are discussing cognitive dissonance. The book gave the definition, the distressing mental state caused by inconsistency between a person's two beliefs or a belief and an action, but we reworded that to when there's a rift between a certain belief of an individual and their action or belief, or another belief that they hold.
Yeah, so usually there's three approaches to reduce this dissonance that we as individuals experience when we take specific actions. So the first one is selective exposure, which is when we kind of avoid information that is incompatible with our beliefs. The second one is self-justifying, which is kind of like making excuses for something that we're doing that isn't like what we believe and what we stand for. And the third one is changing, which is either altering your belief or your behavior. So I kind of just wanted to give an explanation of that since I used those in my example. So my example is wanting to do well on an exam, but going out the night before, minimizing my chances of getting a good grade on my exam. And I picked this simply because this is like an inconsistent behavior. Like I pride myself in being a good student and getting good grades, but I'm going out the night before to party, which would probably reduce my chances of doing well. So I included things that I do to kind of reduce the dissonance that I'd feel. I could simply forget about my exam and avoid talking about school when I'm out with my friends. So this is kind of that first approach to it of saying like selective exposure. So kind of like ignoring the fact that I'm out and just not even thinking about it. The second thing I could do is kind of say something to myself like a couple hours won't make a difference. It's only one exam. There'll be plenty more to like make up my grade, which this is that self-justifying to make myself feel better about what I'm doing. And then the third thing I can do is change, which I can either leave the party to go study so I could do well on the exam, so I'm changing my behavior. Or the other thing I could do is accepting the fact that I'm not a good student like I say I am or as good as I say I am, and accepting the fact that I probably won't do as well on the exam as I'd hoped for. So that's basically my example.
Cool. And then my example is really different, but I actually learned about cognitive dissonance during a class last fall during the presidential election, which was really interesting because we talked about in that class how social media platforms like Facebook, because they're driven by advertising and like kind of your engagement and content, that like they essentially want to only put out content for you that you will click on, which will like generate like ad revenue essentially. And so they use algorithms and they calculate like what specifically in terms of politics, what news articles you're clicking on, and then put out news articles with a certain political slant or from news sources with a slant that they think that you will align with. So and so like for me, it's not like quite as personal of an example, but it kind of demonstrates how we can like become really isolated with like the news that we engage in and like have access to, and how we can like become really isolated in our beliefs, and how we don't really want our beliefs to be challenged. We just want them to be like affirmed by news sources. And so it kind of like forces you to be a little bit more aware of like where you're getting your news from and trying to determine like where or in what like a credible source would be that has good basis for its information, but also might like challenge you or come from a different perspective. So, and I think that using the three kind of like methods, I think this would fall under the first one, which is, I'm forgetting the name of it.
Selective exposure, like
Yeah.
avoiding the information that you don't want to hear.
Exactly. Yeah. Like Facebook kind of does that for you, but I definitely think like it's that selective exposure, like to a T, where it's like, well, this contradicts my political beliefs, I'm just not going to read it. So that was kind of the example that I had.
Awesome.
All right, and my example was, I guess, kind of more definitional. I chose hypocrisy, which everyone pretty much knows the definition of hypocrisy. It's like saying one thing and doing another. But I took that in a lens with religion. And this was, I guess, kind of more personal for me because I've grown up in the Lutheran Church, and the more I would look around me and see the different little hypocritical things that people were doing. Like they would say that you should wait until marriage, but then there were all these kids in high school having sex, and there was just a bunch of different examples for me where I kind of learned this from a young age, but I didn't exactly attribute the name cognitive dissonance to it. So it was just kind of what first clicked with me when I read the chapter. So
Yeah, and I think it's cool that we kind of all had totally different examples of how this theory does apply to so many beliefs in so many different ways, like personally or like political or what you're exposed to in your environment. So I think that's cool.
Yeah, just like building off that, I think that that was one thing I personally kind of like about the theory is that I think it like applies to a lot of areas of life, just with like avoidance or like trying to limit like information that like contradicts your beliefs. So I just thought like it was really broad and had a lot of applications, which is kind of why I thought it was more credible. But
yeah, for me, it was kind of the opposite. As it was for Claire, like I was a little bit not confused, but it was like hard for me to understand why you know, there'd be so much reducing of dissonance when you're like picking to take on a certain behavior, but like now seeing it from what you're saying, Claire, of like how sometimes you're just exposed to this, and not that you kind of like pick to be exposed to it, it kind of like makes more sense, I'd say.
well,
yeah.
Sorry, do you have something to say, Chrissy?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I really don't have anything to say other than I guess like if we have any like critiques of the theory. Like I said, I personally like thought it was really applicable to a lot of things. So I like don't really I have a hard time coming up with like a good critique for it. Especially because like one of the options or like one of the ways that you can handle it is like adapting to like that like different information. So I really feel like it kind of captures like all of I don't know, I just find it really like all encompassing. So it's hard for me to like think of a good critique for it. I think it's pretty relevant, but I don't know if you guys have any critiques of it.
I felt the same way. I think because it was so broad and all encompassing, it's really difficult to find a critique other than the fact that maybe there's a way for it to be more specific, like maybe narrowing it down to different types of cognitive dissonance. Where it could apply in different situations, but other than that, I thought it was really applicable. So,
yeah, I'd agree with that last point. Just maybe having different types, just because of what I mentioned before. Like for me, for my example, it was like I picked to do that behavior. So why is it that I'm picking to do behavior that I'm kind of going against my own beliefs and taking those actions? So why is there this huge conflict? But then for Chrissy's example and for Claire's example, it was more of like you were kind of exposed to it. As I mentioned before, it wasn't something that you picked. So then I think those two, like our examples were so completely different because of one was exposed and the other one we kind of put ourselves there. So yeah.
Well, and I think like it applies to even if like you're trying to like if you choose to ignore the information,
Right.
like what you were saying, because like just in terms of like going back to like my example with like political news, it was like, you know, like there are certain websites that like I'll avoid because like it's kind of like the fake news kind of thing. Like, oh, well, that's just fake news, but like maybe it's not. I don't know. Like I think like people do like self-isolate. Like you can avoid certain like news sources or things like that maybe don't like support your beliefs, or even just like I think like refusing to like read or believe certain studies like related to things. Like I'm pretty sure like bacon is considered like a carcinogen now, but like I'm sure there's a study that's been published by like the CDC or something, but I haven't read it because I just want to keep eating bacon. So like,
yeah,
you can like choose to ignore it. Like
that's true.
Thing. I don't know.
Another interesting thing to go along with that, since you mentioned it, is just the huge debate that has continually been going on with child vaccinations. Something interesting that could apply there would be like the cognitive dissonance between just people who believe themselves that vaccinations are good, but don't want to put the pain or whatever on their child, so they choose not to vaccinate. And the other various scenarios that go along with that just kind of cause issues within society and grow from there.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's it. I don't have anything else.
No, I really don't either. I think we kind of covered it.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.